The silence in the Kensington mansion was a physical presence, thick and heavy as the velvet drapes that kept the London sun at bay. It was a silence I had grown accustomed to over 7 years of marriage, a silence that spoke of polished surfaces and unspoken resentments. My life was a curated exhibit of perfection, and I was its chief curator and primary display. My name is Ilara Vance, and my husband, Julian Vance, was a man built of ambition and cold, hard cash. He was a titan of finance, a man who collected companies, art, and I had once believed a wife he adored. I was young, impressionable, and dazzled by the intensity of his pursuit. He was a storm, and I was a sapling who thought it could weather any gale. I was wrong. The storm had passed, leaving me permanently bent, my roots shallow in the sterile soil of his world. That morning, like every morning, began with a ritual. I rose at 6, my movements silent so as not to disturb Julian, who slept in the master suite. A suite I had been exiled from 2 years prior for the crime of a nightmare that had woken him. "I need my rest, Ilara. The markets don't sleep and neither can I," he'd said, his voice a blade of ice. So I'd moved to the guest room, a beautiful, soulless chamber with a view of the manicured gardens he never walked in. I dressed in silent, expensive clothes, cashmere and silk, the uniform of the wealthy, idle wife. I applied my makeup with a careful hand, painting on the serene, placid expression that was expected. Downstairs, Maria, our housekeeper, had laid out a breakfast I would only pick at. The house hummed with the silent, efficient work of the staff. They were polite, but their eyes held a pity I could barely stand. My purpose, it seemed, was to be beautiful, unobtrusive, and present. A trophy on a dust-free shelf. Julian's love, if it had ever existed, had curdled into a form of benign neglect. He provided everything. A limitless credit card, a fleet of cars, jewels that felt cold against my skin. Everything except himself. His mind was always on the next deal, the next acquisition, the next mountain to conquer. I was a conquered territory he no longer had to visit. The catalyst for the earthquake that was to come was mundane. A spring cleaning directive from Julian himself. "The investors are coming for dinner next month. The place needs to be impeccable. Go through everything, Ilara. I don't want any clutter." He'd said it over dinner the night before, not looking up from his tablet. Clutter. That's what our life, my presence, had become. So I found myself in his study, a room I usually avoided. It was his sanctum, all dark wood, leather, and the faint, lingering scent of his cologne and cigar smoke. It felt like trespassing. My task was to organize the bottom drawer of his massive 19th-century desk, a drawer he'd told me contained old paperwork. The drawer was a chaotic mess, a stark contrast to the obsessive order of the rest of his life. There were faded stock certificates, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and files for companies I'd never heard of. I worked methodically, creating piles for shredding, for filing, for archiving. It was tedious work, and my mind drifted, a dangerous pastime in a house of ghosts. And then my fingers brushed against the edge of a thick, textured paper folder, tucked beneath a ledger from 2015. I pulled it out. It was a simple, cream-colored folder, but it felt heavy with significance. My name was written on the tab in Julian's sharp, angular script. Ilara. A strange foreboding prickled at the back of my neck. Why was a folder with my name buried under years of financial detritus? I opened it. The contents were a curated history of us. The deed to the first small apartment we'd shared, before the money became obscene. Photos from our whirlwind courting period in Nice. Me laughing, wind in my hair, him looking at me with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. Ticket stubs from the opera, a pressed flower from the gardens at Versailles. A wave of nausea, sweet and sickly, washed over me. He had kept these. This evidence of a man I barely remembered. My hands trembled as I sifted through the memories, each one a tiny, sharp knife. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, my blood ran cold. It was a marriage certificate. But it wasn't ours. The paper was different. Ours was on heavy, watermarked parchment, framed in gold and hanging in the main hall. This was simpler, printed on official-looking form paper. My eyes, blurred with unshed tears, scanned the document. Place of marriage. Las Vegas, Clark County, Nevada. Date: May 15, 10 years ago. Groom: Julian Alistair Vance. Bride: Isabella Maria Rossi. The world tilted on its axis. The hum of the central air conditioning became a roar in my ears. Isabella Rossi. The name was a whisper from a forgotten life, a ghost I had never been able to fully exorcise. Julian's first love. The one he told me had left him, broken his heart, the tragedy that had forged him into the hard man he was today. The story I had swallowed whole, using her spectral presence to explain his moments of distance, his coldness. According to this document, she hadn't just left him. He had married her. I stared at the date. This was 3 years before he'd even met me. 3 years before he'd proposed on a gondola in Venice, telling me I was his first and only true love. I had been his second. His bigamous second. The pieces of my life, the narrative I had clung to for 7 years, shattered into a million jagged fragments. The coldness wasn't a scar from a past heartbreak. It was the simple absence of love for me. Our marriage, the foundation upon which I had built my entire identity, was a lie. A beautiful, gilded, illegal lie. A sound escaped my lips, a choked gasp that was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the study. I felt the walls of my gilded cage not as barriers but as an insult. He had trapped me in a beautiful fiction. I was not his wife. I was his mistress, his secret, his clutter. The initial searing hot wave of pain was quickly followed by an ice-cold clarity I hadn't felt in years. The tears dried up before they could fall. I looked around the study at the symbols of his power and control, and I felt not awe but a simmering, profound rage. He thought I was a fool. A beautiful, placid fool who would tend his house and wear his jewels and never question her place. He had played me for a fool for 7 years. Very well. A fool I would be. With hands that no longer trembled, I carefully placed every item back into the folder exactly as I had found it. I slid it back under the ledger, closed the drawer and stood up. My reflection in the dark glass of the bookcase showed a calm, composed woman. But behind her eyes, a new woman was being forged in fire. I would play the dumb, oblivious wife. I would continue the charade. But while I played, I would plan. Julian Vance had taken my love, my trust, and my years. He would not take my freedom. He would not break me. I left the study, closing the door softly behind me. The game was afoot. And for the first time in 7 years, I was the one making the rules. The days that followed the discovery in the study were an exercise in surreal performance art. I moved through my life as Alara Vance, the dutiful wife, with a serene mask firmly glued in place. But beneath the calm exterior, my mind was a war room, mapping strategies, calculating risks, and plotting my escape. Every smile I gave Julian over our silent dinners was a lie. Every time I asked about his day, listened to his monosyllabic replies about market volatility and hostile takeovers, I was gathering intelligence. I needed to know his patterns, his schedule, the rhythm of his life so I could slip out of it without a ripple. "The cleaning is coming along, darling," I said one evening, my voice a carefully modulated tone of mild interest. I speared a piece of asparagus, my hands steady. "That bottom drawer in your study was a nightmare. Just a lot of old financial papers. I've sorted them for archiving." I watched him, my gaze as innocent as a child's. He didn't even look up from his phone where he was scrolling through reports. "Fine. Whatever you think is best." There was not a flicker of concern, not a hint of suspicion. Why would there be? In his world I was furniture. Furniture doesn't have revelations. His dismissal was my confirmation. He felt utterly secure in his deception. Good. Let him feel secure. Let him slumber in the heart of the lie while I sharpened my knife. My first move was logistical. I needed money he couldn't trace. Over the years, Julian had been generous with his wealth, but it was all monitored. My credit cards, my accounts, they were all extensions of his, with statements that likely landed on his assistant's desk. I had a small private bank account from before our marriage, a relic of my old life containing a few £1,000s. It was a seed. I needed a forest. I remembered a piece of information, a casual boast from years ago when Julian was still trying to impress me. He kept a rainy day fund, £50,000 in cash, in a safe behind a false wall in his walk-in closet. A relic of a less stable time, he'd called it. A paranoid habit from before he was a multimillionaire. It was time for a storm. Waiting for him to leave for a 2-day business trip to Zurich was agony. The hours stretched, each minute a taut wire of anticipation. The moment his car pulled away from the curb, I moved. I stood in his closet, a room larger than my first London flat, surrounded by his bespoke suits and rows of handmade shoes. The air smelled of cedar and his cologne, a scent that now made my stomach clench. I found the false panel he'd described, a section of wall that looked seamless but yielded to a firm, specific push. It swung inward silently. There was a small utilitarian safe, nothing like the ornate digital one in his study. I tried the combination he'd drunkenly revealed years ago, a date he'd said was the worst day of his life before he met me. May 15th. The same date on the marriage certificate. The lock clicked open. The bundles of cash were neat, orderly, and anonymous. I didn't take it all. That would be too obvious. I took 30,000, leaving 20 to maintain the illusion that the safe hadn't been touched. It was more than enough to disappear. Next, the documents. I needed a new identity. My own passport was in his study safe, a place I couldn't access. But I had a plan. I contacted an old friend from my art school days, Sasha, a brilliant forger who now worked legitimately as a graphic designer. We hadn't spoken in years, but ours was the kind of friendship that picked up as if no time had passed. I met her in a noisy, anonymous coffee shop in Shoreditch, a world away from Kensington. Her eyes widened when I told her what I needed, a high-quality fake passport and driver's license. "Alara, what the hell? Is he hurting you?" she asked, her voice low and concerned. "In a way you can't imagine," I said, my voice steady. "He stole my life, Sasha. I'm just taking it back." She saw the resolve in my eyes, the cold fire that had replaced the placid warmth she remembered. She nodded slowly. "What name?" I hadn't thought of that. I looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets, at the people living their messy, real lives. I needed a name that was mine. A name that belonged to no one but me. "Alara," I said. "Just Alara. No last name." Sasha got to work. With my cash and a series of discreet, untraceable photos she took in her studio, she promised me a clean, serviceable fake EU passport within a week. The vulnerability of it all was terrifying, but it was a clean, sharp terror so different from the dull, chronic dread of my marriage. The final piece was the destination. It couldn't be somewhere Julian would expect. Not my parents in Cornwall, not the villa in Tuscany we owned. It had to be a place off his radar, a place where I could vanish. I settled on a small coastal town in Portugal, the Algarve. I'd been there once years ago and had loved the wild cliffs, the friendly people, the sense of being at the edge of the world. I found a short-term rental online, a whitewashed cottage with blue shutters overlooking the sea, and paid for the first month in cash through a series of convoluted transfers Sasha helped me orchestrate. During all this, I continued my performance. I went to charity luncheons and smiled vacuously. I discussed curtains with an interior designer. I even had sex with Julian once, a week after my discovery. It was the ultimate act of theater, my body present while my mind was a million miles away, on a sun-drenched cliff in Portugal. I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of my own deception mirroring his. Afterward, as he slept, I went to my bathroom and scrubbed my skin until it was raw, washing away the ghost of his touch. The day Sasha delivered the passport was the day I knew I was ready. The document felt flimsy in my hands, a fragile thing, but it represented a strength I hadn't possessed in years. It was my key. That night I packed a single large suitcase. Not with my designer clothes and jewels, but with practical, simple items, a few cherished books and my own pre-marriage photographs. I left behind the diamonds, the furs, the gowns. They were costumes for a role I was retiring. I wrote a letter. It was short and I drafted it a dozen times. It couldn't be emotional. It couldn't be angry. It had to be a simple, factual statement that would land with the force of a torpedo. "Julian, I found the marriage certificate. I know about Isabella. I hope the two of you are very happy. Do not try to find me. Alara." I left it on the kitchen island, propped against the fruit bowl. A quiet, domestic setting for a nuclear bomb. The next morning I called a taxi from a service we never used. As it pulled away from the mansion for the last time, I didn't look back. I looked at the fake passport in my hands, at the name I had chosen for myself. Just Alara. I was no one's wife. I was a ghost and I was finally, blessedly free. The first breath of Algarve air was like a baptism. It was clean, sharp with the scent of salt and pine, scouring the London smog from my lungs and the lingering psychic residue of Julian's world from my soul. The taxi from Faro Airport wound through hills dotted with almond trees, their blossoms like late snow, before descending towards the coast and the small whitewashed town of Alhio. My new home was exactly as the pictures had promised. A small, square cottage, its walls blindingly white against the brilliant blue sky, perched on a cliff edge with a view of the endless Atlantic. It was called Casa de Saudade, the House of Longing. The irony was not lost on me. I was longing for a self I had yet to become. The first few days were a blur of disorientation and profound silence. The silence here was different from the Kensington mansion. That had been a dead, oppressive silence. This was a living, breathing quiet, filled with the distant crash of waves, the cry of gulls, the whisper of the wind through the sea grasses. It was a silence that allowed me to hear my own thoughts for the first time in years. I unpacked my single suitcase, placing my few belongings in the simple wooden dresser. The cottage was sparsely furnished, a wrought iron bed, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs. It was all I needed. I had shed the skin of Alara Vance, the society wife, and the new skin felt raw, exposed, but thrillingly real. My days fell into a new, simple rhythm. I woke with the sun, made strong coffee on the gas stove, and took it out to the small terrace overlooking the sea. I would sit for hours, just watching the water change color from slate gray to sapphire to gold. I walked for miles along the cliff paths, my body growing lean and brown under the sun. I bought fresh fish from the old men mending their nets in the harbor, bread from the bakery, and figs from the market, relearning the simple sensual pleasure of feeding myself. I was a ghost and I reveled in my ghostliness. I spoke to no one beyond the necessary pleasantries. The locals, used to the ebb and flow of foreigners, left me to my solitude. I was just another woman escaping something, and in a place like this, that was a story they understood. But the ghost of Julian was not so easily exorcised. In the quiet moments, his face would surface in my mind. Not the cold, dismissive man of recent years, but the man I had fallen in love with. The man who had whispered promises in the dark, who had looked at me as if I were the only woman in the world. Had any of it been real? Or had I just been a stand-in, a body to fill the space left by Isabella Rossi? The pain was a physical ache, a hollowed-out place beneath my ribs. One afternoon, about a week after my arrival, a storm rolled in from the sea. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the little cottage, rattling the shutters. I built a small fire in the hearth and curled up on the rug with a book, but I couldn't concentrate. The fury of the storm mirrored the turmoil inside me. I found myself thinking not of Julian but of Isabella. Who was she? Was she still alive? Were they still married? Had their entire relationship been a fiction designed to elicit my sympathy and ensure my compliance? Or was the truth even more twisted? I had no answers, only the gut-wrenching certainty that the foundation of my adult life was rotten. The rage returned then, hot and cleansing. It was better than the grief. I welcomed it. I let it burn away the last vestiges of my love for him. He was not a tragic figure. He was a liar and a fraud. And I had been his perfect, gullible victim. But no more. As the storm raged outside, I made a decision. I couldn't spend the rest of my life hiding, a ghost on a cliff edge. I had to become someone new. I had to build a life, not just escape an old one. The next day the world was washed clean. The air was sparkling and the sea was a calm, brilliant blue. I walked into the town and, using some of my dwindling cash, bought a simple set of watercolor paints, brushes, and a pad of thick paper. It was an impulse, a memory of a self I had buried long ago. Before Julian, before the money, I had been an artist. A struggling, hopeful art student. He had encouraged it at first, then gently, then firmly steered me away. It's a hobby, darling. Not a life. Your life is with me now. I took my new supplies back to the terrace and simply stared at the blank page. My hands, which had grown accustomed to holding only a credit card or a champagne flute, felt clumsy and strange. I dipped a brush in water, loaded it with a streak of ultramarine, and touched it to the paper. It was a shaky, amateurish line. But it was a start. I painted the sea. I painted the sky. I painted the red-tiled roofs of the town tumbling down to the water. I lost myself in the flow of color, in the challenge of capturing light. It was frustrating, exhilarating, and utterly absorbing. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about Julian. I was not planning an escape. I was simply being. Weeks bled into a month. My tan deepened, my muscles strengthened from the long walks, and a new light entered my eyes when I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was thinner, harder, her gaze direct and unapologetic. She was Alara. Just Alara. I started to venture out more. I had a coffee at the same cafe every morning, and the owner, a kindly woman named Sophia, began to greet me by name. I sold a few of my watercolor sketches to a tourist shop in town for a pittance, but the pride I felt was worth more than any of Julian's diamonds. It was money I had earned myself. I was building a life brick by tiny brick. It was a humble life, a quiet life, but it was mine. I had no man, no mansion, no fortune. But I had my freedom, my paints, and the vast, endless sky. It was enough. It was more than enough. I was healing. The wound was still there, a scar that would always be tender to the touch, but it was no longer bleeding. I had stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Julian was a ghost from a past life, a bad dream receding in the bright Portuguese sun. I was, against all odds, happy. And that's when the world cracked open for the second time. It happened on a Tuesday. Market day. The harbor was a riot of color and noise, stalls overflowing with glistening fish, pyramids of oranges, and bundles of fragrant herbs. I was haggling cheerfully with a fisherman over a sea bass, my Portuguese still broken but functional, the sun warm on my bare shoulders. I felt rooted, real. This was my life now. And then I saw him. He was standing at the end of the cobbled street 50 yards away, but there was no mistaking him. The tall, broad-shouldered frame, the way he held himself with an innate, predatory authority that was utterly out of place amidst the easygoing chaos of the market. Julian. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely, then slam against my ribs like a trapped bird. The world narrowed to a tunnel, the vibrant colors bleaching out, the sounds of the market becoming a distant roar. The sea bass slipped from my numb fingers, landing on the cobbles with a soft thud. How had he found me? I had been so careful. The cash, the fake passport, the cottage rented under my new name. I was a ghost. His eyes locked onto mine. They were dark, intense, and filled with a turmoil I had never seen in them before. He looked haggard. His usually immaculate suit was rumpled, his tie loose, and a dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He took a step towards me. Panic, pure and primal, seized me. The flight instinct that had been my constant companion in those last days in London roared back to life. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I plunged into the crowd, weaving through the stalls, my heart hammering in my throat. I heard him call my name, Ilara. His voice, usually so controlled, was raw, desperate. It only made me run faster. I ducked down a narrow alleyway, my sandals slapping against the stone. I knew these streets intimately now, my daily walks having mapped every turn, every dead end. I led him on a frantic chase, cutting through a courtyard filled with drying laundry, doubling back through a small square, finally losing myself in the labyrinth of the old town. I didn't stop until I reached the relative safety of my cottage, slamming the blue wooden door shut and leaning against it, my chest heaving. He had found me. The gilded cage had walls that stretched across continents. For hours I sat on the floor, my back against the door, waiting. I expected the sound of a car engine, a fist pounding on the wood, his voice demanding I let him in. But nothing came. Only the familiar, comforting sounds of the wind and the waves. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, my panic began to curdle into a cold, hard anger. How dare he? How dare he invade my sanctuary, my hard-won peace? He had stolen 7 years of my life. He would not steal this. Cautiously I peered out the window. The cliff road was empty. Had I imagined it? No. The terror was too real. He was here. Somewhere. The next day I didn't go to the market. I stayed inside, my freedom suddenly feeling like a new, more fragile prison. I tried to paint, but my hands were shaking. Every sound made me jump. On the third day, a small, sealed note was slipped under my door. My name was written on the front in his familiar, sharp script. My blood ran cold. I left it there for hours, a white rectangle of menace on my terracotta tiles. Finally, with trembling fingers, I picked it up and opened it. It wasn't the legal threat or the angry demand I had expected. It was only 5 words. Please. I need to explain. The audacity of it took my breath away. Explain? What was there to explain? The facts were printed on a marriage certificate, clear and incontrovertible. There was no explanation that could undo that betrayal. I tore the note into 100 tiny pieces and threw them into the fireplace. But he didn't leave. He became a specter haunting the edges of my new life. I would see him in the distance standing on the cliff path watching my cottage. He never approached, never tried to force a conversation. He was just there. A constant, unsettling reminder of the past I had fled. My peace was shattered. The joy I had found in my simple routines evaporated, replaced by a constant low-grade anxiety. I stopped painting. I stopped going to the cafe. I became a recluse again, but this time out of fear, not choice. A week after his appearance, I broke. I couldn't live like this, looking over my shoulder every moment. I had to confront him. I had to send him away for good. I waited until evening, when the sun was a molten gold sinking into the sea. I knew where he would be. I walked out to the cliff edge to a secluded bench overlooking the water. He was there as I knew he would be, his silhouette dark against the dying light. He heard my approach and turned. In the soft twilight he looked even more worn. The lines on his face were deeper, and the arrogance that usually cloaked him was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. "Elara," he said, his voice rough. I stopped a safe distance away, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture. "You need to leave, Julian." "I can't." He looked out at the sea. "Not until you listen." "There's nothing to listen to," I said, my voice cold though my knees felt weak. "I saw the certificate. You married Isabella Rossi 3 years before you married me. That makes you a bigamist and me a fool. The conversation is over." "It's not what you think," he said, turning his gaze back to me. The intensity in his eyes was frightening. "Isabella, she's dead, Elara." The words landed, but they didn't have the effect he probably intended. They only fueled my rage. "So, you thought you'd just replace her? Was I a good substitute? Did I look enough like her?" "No." The word was ripped from him, loud and sharp in the quiet evening. He took a step towards me and I instinctively stepped back. He froze, a pained expression crossing his face. "It wasn't like that. Our marriage, it was never valid." I stared at him, my heart a drum in my ears. "What are you talking about?" He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "The marriage in Vegas. It was a joke. A stupid, drunken mistake during a lost weekend. We were kids. We had it annulled the next Monday. It was legally dissolved before I ever met you." The world tilted again. An annulment? It was a possibility that had never occurred to me. In my shock and rage, I had jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Could it be true? Could the entire foundation of my pain and my flight have been based on a misunderstanding? I searched his face, looking for the lie, the manipulation. But all I saw was a raw, desperate honesty I had never witnessed in him before. Then why? My voice was a whisper, frayed with confusion and a dawning, terrifying hope. "Why was the certificate there? Why keep it a secret? You told me she broke your heart and left. You let me believe a lie for 7 years." He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Because the truth was worse," he said, his voice so low I almost couldn't hear it over the waves. "The truth is I killed her." The air left my lungs. The world went silent. The last of the sun's light seemed to drain from the sky. And in the gathering darkness, Julian Vance, the man who controlled everything, began to break down. The words hung in the salt-tinged air between us, monstrous and unbelievable. "I killed her." I took an involuntary step back, my mind reeling. "Murder? Julian?" He was cold, ruthless in business, but a killer? The man standing before me seemed to shrink, the confession leaching all the power and presence from his frame. "What?" I finally managed to choke out. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on some invisible point on the darkening horizon, lost in a memory I couldn't see. "It was a car accident," he said, his voice flat, emptied of all emotion. 6 months after the annulment. We'd stayed friends, but we tried to. It was messy. We were arguing. In the car. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet. "I was driving. I took a corner too fast. Lost control." The clinical recitation was more terrifying than any dramatic telling could have been. This was a story he had told himself 1,000 times, sanding down the edges until it was a smooth, painful stone he carried in his gut. "She died on impact," he continued, still in that hollow monotone. "I walked away with a broken arm and bruises. The police investigated. It was ruled an accident. No charges. But I knew. I was angry, I was reckless. I killed the woman I loved." The wind whipped around us, a cold counterpoint to the heat of his confession. My anger, my righteous fury, was rapidly being replaced by a stunned, complicated pity. All these years I had thought his coldness was a lack of love for me. Now I saw it for what it was, a prison of guilt and self-loathing. I couldn't tell you, he said, finally turning to look at me. In the twilight his eyes were black pools of torment. How could I? Hello Alara, I'm Julian. I'm rich and successful, and by the way, I'm responsible for the death of my first wife. You would have run a mile. And you were light. You were joy. You were everything that wasn't darkness and death. I was selfish. I wanted you. So I created a safer, simpler story. A heartbreak. A woman who left. It was easier for both of us. Easier for you, I corrected him, my voice trembling. You built our entire marriage on a lie, Julian. You let me live in the shadow of a ghost, thinking I was second best, that I could never measure up to the great lost love of your life. When all along you were just haunted. He flinched as if I'd struck him. Yes, I was haunted. I am haunted. Every day. And I locked that part of myself away because I thought if I could just be perfect, if I could build a perfect life with you, the ghost would fade. But it didn't. It just grew louder and I shut down. I pushed you away. I buried myself in work because it was the only thing that numbed the pain. I know I was cold. I know I was absent. I know I failed you in every way a husband can fail a wife. And I am so sorry, Alara. He was crying. Silent, helpless tears tracked through the stubble on his cheeks. I had never seen Julian cry. I hadn't thought him capable of it. The sight was more shocking than his confession. When I came home and found your note, his voice broke. The house was so empty. It was the silence after the crash. It was losing her all over again. But this time it was my fault. Completely, undeniably my fault. I had driven you away. I broke down, Alara. Right there on the marble floor of that fucking mausoleum. I broke into 1,000 pieces. He took a ragged breath. It took me a month to find you. I hired everyone I could. I was desperate. Not to drag you back. I have no right to ask that of you. But to see you. To tell you the truth. To beg for your forgiveness, not for my sake but for yours. You deserve to know that you were never second best. You were my salvation. And I was too much of a coward to let you save me. He fell silent, his confession complete. The only sounds were the wind, the waves, and his ragged breathing. I stood there, frozen, my mind trying to process the tectonic shift in reality. The villain of my story had just rewritten his part. He wasn't a bigamist. He was a grief-stricken man who had made a catastrophic error in judgment and spent a decade punishing himself for it. The coldness, the distance, the exile to the guest room. It wasn't a lack of love. It was a manifestation of a guilt so profound it had walled him off from the world, from me. The anger was still there, a hot coal. He had lied. For 7 years he had looked me in the eye and lied. He had let me believe a fiction that had eroded my self-worth. That was not something a simple confession could erase. But the hatred, the desire for revenge? It felt small and petty now, dwarfed by the immense, tragic landscape of his pain. My revenge had been to leave him in an empty mansion, and he had told me it was the second worst moment of his life. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know what to do. I understand if you can never forgive me, he whispered, his voice raw. I needed you to know the truth. You have every right to your anger, to your life here. It's beautiful. You look like yourself again. He looked at me then, a long, deep look that seemed to take in my sun-bleached hair, my simple cotton dress, the new strength in my posture. It was a look of love and of loss. I'll leave in the morning, he said softly. I won't bother you again. You have my word. He turned and began to walk away, his figure a lonely silhouette against the vast star-dusted sky. Julian, I called out. He stopped but didn't turn around. I didn't know what I wanted to say. I forgive you was a lie. I hate you was no longer true. Stay was an impossibility. The folder, I said finally, my voice quiet. In your desk. With the photos. The ticket stubs. Why did you keep it? He was silent for a long moment. Because that was the only part of my life that was ever real, he said. The only part that wasn't touched by the crash. It was my proof that once for a little while I had been happy. With you. And with that he walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me alone on the cliff with the echo of his truth and the shattered pieces of my own. Sleep was impossible. Julian's confession played on a loop in my mind, a tragic film with a plot twist I never saw coming. I killed her. You were my salvation. I was too much of a coward to let you save me. I paced the small confines of Casa de Saudade, the four walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now feeling like a cage. The ghost that haunted this house was no longer just the ghost of Isabella Rossi. It was the ghost of the man I thought I'd married, and the specter of the broken man who had just bared his soul to me. My carefully constructed new reality had unraveled in the space of a single conversation. The foundation of my anger, the belief that he had never loved me, that I was a placeholder, was gone. In its place was a messy, complicated, and terrifying truth. He had loved me too much to show me his darkness. He had loved me, and his love, twisted by grief and guilt, had become a weapon that wounded us both. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, I knew I couldn't let him leave. Not like this. Not with this chasm of the unsaid between us. I had to talk to him. I had to know more. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about understanding. I needed to understand the man I had shared my life with for 7 years. I didn't know where he was staying. The only expensive hotel in the area was a converted monastery a few miles down the coast. It was a guess, but a logical one. I threw on a dress and walked out into the cool morning air, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The hotel was quiet, the lobby empty save for a lone clerk. I approached the desk, my resolve faltering. What was I doing? Chasing after the man whose lies had shattered me? "Can I help you, Senora?" the clerk asked, his voice polite. "I'm looking for Julian Vance," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The clerk's eyes flickered with recognition. "Ah, Mr. Vance. He checked out about an hour ago." My heart plummeted. He was gone. He had kept his word. A wave of something that felt alarmingly like loss washed over me. Did he leave a forwarding address? A note? No, Senora. He just settled his bill and left. He asked for directions to the airport. I thanked him and walked out of the cool, dark lobby into the blinding morning sun. He was gone. It was over. The finality of it should have been a relief. It was what I had wanted when I fled London. But the emptiness I felt was profound, a vast, echoing chamber where my anger used to live. I walked back towards the cliffs, my steps slow and heavy. I had gotten what I asked for. He had told me the truth, and he had left me in peace. So why did this peace feel so much like desolation? I reached my cottage and stopped. Leaning against the blue door was a simple, brown paper-wrapped parcel. There was no note. But I knew who it was from. I carried it inside, my hands trembling as I untied the string. Inside was a stack of papers. On top was a formal legal document from the state of Nevada. Decree of annulment, Vance versus Rossi. The date was 3 months before Julian and I had met. He had told the truth. Beneath it were more documents. The official police report of the car accident. I skimmed it with a sick feeling in my stomach. It was just as he had said. Single vehicle accident, excessive speed a factor, passenger deceased, driver Julian Alistair Vance, treated for minor injuries. No criminal charges filed. A tragic accident. And beneath that, at the bottom of the stack, was a single worn photograph. It was of Julian and a woman. Isabella. She was beautiful with dark curling hair and a laughing, vibrant face. Julian had his arm around her, and he was looking at her with a raw, open adoration I had only ever seen glimpses of in our earliest days. They looked young, incandescently happy, and utterly doomed. This was the ghost. This was the memory that had held him captive. Not a perfect angel, but a real, laughing woman whose life was cut short. And he had loved her. I sat on the floor for a long time, the documents spread around me. The evidence was incontrovertible. He had not been a bigamist. He had been a grieving man. A liar, yes. A coward, absolutely. But not the monster I had constructed in my mind. My revenge, my grand escape, now felt like a cruel overreaction. I had punished him for a crime he didn't commit. I had left him alone in that empty mansion with a note designed to inflict maximum pain, based on a truth I hadn't bothered to verify. The clarity was brutal. In my self-righteous fury, I had become as cruel as I believed him to be. I thought of the man on the cliff last night, broken, weeping, stripped of all his power and pride. That was the real Julian Vance. Not the cold financier, not the neglectful husband, but the man drowning in a grief he could never share. And I had loved that man once. Deeply. Passionately. Had that love truly died? Or had it just been buried under layers of resentment and a monumental misunderstanding? A new, terrifying thought began to form in my mind. What if our story wasn't over? What if it had simply taken a devastating, necessary detour? What if the truth, however painful, was the only thing that could have broken us open enough to heal? I looked around the cottage at my half-finished painting on the easel, at the simple life I had built. It was a good life. A peaceful life. But was it a whole life? Or was I, like Julian, just hiding from a pain I didn't want to face? He was on his way to the airport. He would be back in London by evening, back in the empty mansion surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. I couldn't let that happen. I didn't know if I could forgive him. I didn't know if we could ever put the pieces back together. But I knew that walking away without all the facts was a mistake I had already made once. I wouldn't make it again. I had to see him. I had to talk to him. Not as his avenger, but as the woman who had once loved him. As the woman who perhaps still did. Grabbing my bag and the keys to the beat-up little Fiat I'd bought for errands, I ran out the door. I had to get to the airport. I had to stop him from leaving. The race against time, against the ghosts of the past, had begun. But this time I wasn't running away. I was running towards something, and the destination was terrifyingly, exhilaratingly unknown. The drive to Faro Airport was a blur of white-knuckled tension and desperate prayers. I wove through the slow-moving tourist traffic on the N125, my heart in my throat, every minute feeling like an eternity. What if his flight was early? What if he was already through security? What if, after baring his soul, he had taken my silence as a final rejection and was now sealing himself away forever? I screeched into the short-term parking lot, abandoning the Fiat in the first available space, and ran into the departures hall. The place was a chaos of holidaymakers and business travelers. My eyes scanned the crowds, searching for that familiar tall frame. There, at the British Airways ticket counter. He was facing away from me, a single leather carry-on bag at his feet, his posture one of utter dejection. Even from behind he looked defeated. The powerful, untouchable Julian Vance was gone, replaced by a man waiting to board a flight back to a hollow life. Julian. The name tore from my lips, louder than I intended. Several people turned to look. He froze, his shoulders stiffening. Slowly he turned around. The look on his face was one of pure, unvarnished shock. His eyes, shadowed and tired, widened in disbelief. Elara. I stopped a few feet from him, my chest heaving not from the run, but from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I was doing. You didn't say goodbye. He just stared at me as if I were a mirage. I didn't think you wanted me to. I didn't know what I wanted, I said, my voice shaking. Until you were gone. I found the package. I saw the documents. He looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. So now you know. It doesn't change what I did. The lies. No, it doesn't, I agreed, my voice growing stronger. But it changes the context. You let me believe I was living in another woman's shadow. You let me think your coldness was because you didn't love me, when it was because you loved her so much you couldn't forgive yourself for losing her. He flinched. It's not an excuse. It's not, I said. But it's an explanation. And I deserved one. We both deserved more than the farce we were living. The airport announcements echoed around us, a surreal soundtrack to our reckoning. We were having the most important conversation of our lives in the middle of a bustling terminal. Why are you here, Elara? He asked, his voice low and raw. To tell me you forgive me? You don't have to. I don't expect it. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said honestly. The words were harsh, but they were true. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a road. And I don't know if I'm ready to walk it. But I know I couldn't let you get on that plane without telling you that I understand. Tears welled in his eyes again, but he didn't try to hide them. Understand what? That you're not a monster. You're a man who made a terrible, tragic mistake and then made another one by trying to bury it. You built a fortress around your heart to protect yourself, and you ended up imprisoning us both. He was silent, his gaze locked on mine, waiting. I was so angry, I whispered, the memory of that pain sharp and fresh. Finding that certificate, it broke me. And my revenge was to break you in return. I thought it would make me feel powerful. But it just left me empty. And hearing your truth, It broke me all over again, but in a different way. I took a step closer, closing the distance between us. The scent of him, his cologne mixed with the salt air, was achingly familiar. I can't go back to the way things were, Julian. I won't. That woman, the one in the Kensington mansion, she's gone. I killed her off just as surely as you killed the man you were before the accident. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I don't want her back. I want you. This you. The one who stands in the sun and paints and fights for her life. His words sent a shockwave through me. It was what I had secretly, desperately wanted to hear. Not that he wanted his wife back, but that he wanted the woman I had become. Then we have to start over, I said, the idea forming as I spoke it, both terrifying and exhilarating. No more lies. No more secrets. No more hiding in plain sight. If there's even a chance for us, it has to be as who we are now. Two broken people who have to learn to trust each other again. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The touch was electric, a jolt of memory and possibility. How do we do that? I don't know, I admitted. One day at a time. With a lot of talking. And a lot of honesty. It would be messy. It would be hard. I'm not afraid of hard, he said, his eyes burning with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. I'm only afraid of a life without you in it. It was a promise. A plea. A beginning. Cancel your flight, I said softly. He didn't hesitate. He turned to the ticket agent and said, I need to cancel this booking. As he dealt with the logistics, I stood there, my mind reeling. What was I doing? Was I insane? Taking back the man whose lies had shattered me? But he wasn't the same man. And I wasn't the same woman. We were two survivors of the same shipwreck, washed up on the same shore. He finished at the counter and turned back to me, his bag in his hand. The weight on his shoulders seemed to have lifted just a little. The despair in his eyes had been replaced by a fragile, desperate hope. What now? He asked. Now, I said, taking a deep breath. You come back to the cottage. We talk. We start from the beginning. And where is the beginning? He asked. I looked at him, this complicated, wounded, brilliant man I had loved and hated, and felt a flicker of the old love, not as a naive girl, but as a woman who knew the cost. My name is Alara, I said, a small, tentative smile touching my lips. It's nice to meet you. A real, genuine smile broke through his grief, transforming his face. It was like the sun coming out after long winter. He took my hand, his grip firm and sure. Julian, he said. It's a pleasure to meet you, Alara. And hand in hand we walked out of the airport, leaving the ghosts of the past behind us, and stepping into the uncertain, terrifying and hopeful future. The drive back to Alhia was silent, but it was a different kind of silence from the one that had plagued our marriage. This wasn't the dead, heavy quiet of things left unsaid. It was the fragile, humming silence of a new beginning, charged with possibility and fraught with the fear of missteps. Julian sat in the passenger seat of my little Fiat, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He didn't try to make conversation. He just looked out the window at the passing landscape of almond groves and whitewashed villages, as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps he was. The man who had arrived here a few days ago had been a hunter, desperate and single-minded. The man returning with me was a guest. Supplicant. When we arrived at Casa de Saudade, he followed me inside, pausing on the threshold as if entering a sacred space. He looked around the simple room, his eyes taking in the rustic furniture, the easel with my half-finished painting, the open doors leading to the terrace and the endless blue sea. This is you, he said softly, more to himself than to me. This is really you. Yes, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It is. I made tea, the familiar ritual giving my hands something to do. We sat at the small wooden table, the same table where I had eaten so many solitary meals, and now it felt impossibly small with him there. Where do we start? He asked, cradling his mug. The truth, I said. All of it. No more edited versions. I want to know about her. About Isabella. Not the ghost, but the woman. And so he talked. He told me about meeting her at university, about her fiery temper and her reckless joy. He spoke of their volatile, passionate relationship, the drunken weekend in Vegas, the sober, awkward annulment. He described the painful, confused months that followed, the attempt at friendship, the final, fateful argument in the car. He didn't spare himself. He described his arrogance, his anger, the moment he lost control of the vehicle. He spoke of the silence after the crash, the crushing guilt, the funeral where her family had looked at him with a grief too profound for blame. I listened not as his wife but as a witness. I let his pain wash over me, and for the first time I felt not jealousy, but a profound sorrow for the young man he had been, for the life that had been lost. Then it was my turn. I told him what it was like to be the second wife, to always feel the presence of a perfect lost love. I described the slow, chilling realization that the man I married was disappearing behind a wall of work and coldness. I told him about the loneliness in the mansion, the feeling of being an accessory, a piece of art on the wall. And I told him about finding the certificate, the shattering of my world, the meticulous planning of my escape. He listened with the same intensity one had given him, his eyes never leaving my face. When I described the moment I left the note on the kitchen island, he flinched, but he didn't interrupt. "I am so sorry, Alara," he said when I finished, his voice thick with remorse. "For all of it. For the lie, for the neglect, for making you feel so small and so alone. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that up to you, whether you're with me or not." "I know," I said. And I did know. The truth had set us both free, but it had also bound us together in a new way, in shared brokenness. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. Julian checked into a small penseo in town, respecting the sanctity of my space. But we spent every day together. We walked the cliff paths for hours talking. We ate at simple seafood restaurants on the harbor talking. We sat on my terrace as the stars came out talking. We were learning each other all over again. I saw a humility in him I never knew existed. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He was curious about my painting, about my life here, about the person I had become without him. And I saw the man I had fallen in love with begin to re-emerge from his shell of grief. The real Julian. Witty, fiercely intelligent, surprisingly tender when he let his guard down. He wasn't trying to impress me or win me back with grand gestures. He was just present. One afternoon I was working on a watercolor of the harbor. He was sitting nearby, reading a book, content in the quiet companionship. I made a mistake, a clumsy stroke of green that ruined the composition. I muttered a curse under my breath. He looked up. "What's wrong?" "I ruined it," I said, frustrated. "It's trash." He got up and came to stand behind me, looking over my shoulder at the painting. "I don't know," he said softly. "I think it's interesting. Looks like the water is moving. The rest of it is so still, this one stroke gives it life." I looked at the painting again, seeing it through his eyes. The mistake did give it a sense of motion, of imperfection that made it feel more real. It was a small thing, but it was a revelation. He saw me. He saw my art. He wasn't dismissing it as a hobby, he was engaging with it. A week turned into 2. The easy rhythm of my life had expanded to include him. We were building something new, brick by careful brick, on the foundation of our shattered past. It was tentative and fragile, but it was real. One evening we were on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. The air was warm, filled with the scent of jasmine and the sea. "I have to go back to London soon," he said, his voice quiet. "There are things I need to handle. The company, the house." My heart clenched. The real world was knocking. "What will you do with the house?" "Sell it," he said without hesitation. "It was never a home. It was a tomb. I don't want to live in a tomb anymore." He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "I'm not asking you to come back with me. What we're doing here, it's yours. I would never ask you to give it up. But I was wondering, if I were to find a place here. Something small. Something real. Would you be willing to let me be a part of your life? On your terms." It wasn't a demand. It was an offering. He was offering to build a life in my world, not drag me back to his. I looked at him, at this man who had been my greatest love and my greatest heartbreak, who had lied to me and then bared his soul to me. The anger was gone. The desire for revenge was a distant, shameful memory. In its place was a complicated, deep, and resilient love. A love that had been tested in fire and had, against all odds, survived. I reached out and took his hand, lacing my fingers with his. His grip was warm, solid, real. "I think I'd like that," I said softly. The smile that spread across his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was full of hope and love, and a future we would build together, not as the people we were, but as the people we had become. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to pepper the violet sky. We sat there hand in hand in the house of longing, but the longing was finally, blessedly, over. We had found our way home to each other, and our story was just beginning. The end.